Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here to talk about the present and what we can do over the coming years to shape the future. I'm Egon Terplan. I'm the Regional Planning Director of SPUR, and you heard a little bit about us, and we are speaking about our vision for the Bay Area in 2070. SPUR, as you heard, is a member-supported organization with over 6,000 members. We have offices in San Jose. This is our office on South 1st Street. We encourage you to come visit. We also have offices in San Francisco and Oakland, and we're thinking about good planning and good government for the future of this region. And I should say this region, when we're talking about it, is the 9-county Bay Area. We, of course, here are thinking about Silicon Valley, and in many ways, Silicon Valley has broadened and expanded, and much of the entire Bay Area is now part of Silicon Valley. So we have looked at, for many years, some of the major issues and questions facing this region, and we have, in recent years, launched a project looking at the Bay Area in 2070. It is what we are calling a regional strategy, and it builds on a lot of the work we have been doing for the last generation. But the question is, why 2070? Why 50 years? What's significant about that? And it was interesting to just hear about 50 years for applied materials. But when we think about these 50-year chunks, it's larger than a typical career, but it's certainly within a lifetime. But in the history of this region, if you go back to 1870, it was a very small region. In 1920, it was still a reasonably small region. But in the period from 1920 to 1970, this region boomed. And in fact, that was really a boom that took place from World War II beyond. But in the 1920s is when we really started our work in regionalism. And the East Bay Regional Parks District was formed when we came together across multiple cities and counties to create an asset that is enduring. And that's in its, yeah, let's give applause. It's that type of action across our community boundaries that creates what's so wonderful about this region. And then in those decades after World War II, it's when we really came together and confronted some of the major challenges we were facing, and we created institutions that are enduring for today. What did we do? We saved the Bay. At that period of time, we were filling the Bay over 2 square miles per year. And then people came together, particularly 3 women that we're going to hear about more, came together to try to do something about it. And we created an institution, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, to govern the thinking and planning for the Bay. We designed and built BART. BART was the first post-war rail system in the United States. And we, of course, we preserved the Green Belt and created the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And those institutions continue, and they have expanded over time. Of course, BART didn't come to Santa Clara County initially when it was created, but it is coming now. And so these are institutions that we can move forward with. But none of those actions were inevitable. None of what we did in that period of time was something that would have happened unless we had come together and made a commitment to do great things. Since 1970, there's been extraordinary progress, and so much of what's happened in Silicon Valley has been a contributing factor. And we heard some of that from Russ's comments, and we've heard that in all the various State of the Valley conferences and other conferences in many years. But also our civic will for the big actions and the bold actions has lagged to a certain extent. Those institutions I mentioned, so many of them were put in place right around 1970, in addition to BART and Golden Gate National Recreation Area. We created Metropolitan Transportation Commission to govern a lot of the transportation funding for our region. But we never quite finished the job. We created a lot of institutions that were very wonderful, but they ended up being somewhat siloed and somewhat focused on individual issues and or not focused on the scale of the problem, not focused on the entire region. And in that period of time, in those intervening decades, so much progress has happened, though. Recombinant DNA took place in 1972 in terms of analysis and launched the biotech revolution, invented the personal computer, the internet, search, all the work happening with artificial intelligence. This is the progress that happened in many ways coming out of the research institutions and companies of this region, but our public will and our collective will to solve the big problems lagged. And that is what we need to think about for the coming 50 years. The question we ask is, what will our legacy be, our generation's legacy to solve these big issues? So we've thought about this through the lens of 2 particular questions. What are the driving forces that are external to us that will shape what we can work on? And what are the trends that we together can actually change the outcomes are? And what's important about external forces is they are going to happen no matter what, things like climate change. But at the scale of the region, we can't stop them. Yet at the scale of the region, we have to prepare for them and figure out our own response. Now, trends are something different. Housing affordability is a trend. It is not inevitable. Our point, our goal, is to shape that outcome, is to shape it differently so that the future does not look like the past and doesn't look like the present. So I'm going to go through a couple of those driving forces and some of those trends, and then I'm going to pass to my colleague Alicia to talk about the specific scenarios that we envision for the future. So climate change, we know, is now unstoppable. We are responding to it, though, and the point now becomes, how do we adapt to it? How do we adapt to the rising tides that we saw so prevalently this week, the flooding that takes place? That is in some ways what the reality of the future will be like. Whether it's 3 feet or 4 feet of sea level rise in 2050, 2070, 2090, or beyond, we know we must adapt to it. But it's not just the rising seas, it's also, of course, the fires that we experienced last fall and we continue to experience in this region and throughout California. There's an inevitability to that, but our response is not inevitable. How we adapt, how we decide where we grow in the future, whether we continue to put homes in the wild-land-urban interface is a question that we have to ask ourselves. Another driving force, of course, is earthquakes. We've lived with that reality, and an earthquake is also inevitable. But how we prepare for that, the level at which we prepare our homes, we seismically retrofit our communities, the level at which we plan for how to respond to the immediate aftermath of an earthquake, and of course what we do in the rebuilding afterwards. Those are the kinds of choices that we make. And just as an example of this, a significant portion of a lot of the affordable homes in our region are right along the Hayward Fault. So are we going to shore up those homes so that when the earthquake happens, the people in those homes can stay and they can be a part of our region? Those are our choices. Our choice is not about whether or not there will be an earthquake. Another driving, of course, demographics. Population is changing, it's aging. It's also becoming more diverse. Those are realities, and those are realities that we have the question of how do we plan for that? How do we make sure that we include everyone? And just a number to put on this, there's going to be 1 million retirees by 2030 in this region. Those retirees, we hope, can become a part of our communities, stay in our communities, age in place, and that will continue to happen for a long time. But it's also a tremendous opportunity to make sure that the younger generation has the skills, the networks, and the connections to get into those jobs that the retirees have left. It's actually one of the greatest opportunities to bring a whole generation of people who may not have access to the great employment opportunities of this region. Those are the kinds of choices that we can make. Another technological change that everyone here is extremely familiar with is, a driving force is technological change. And automation is something that we're going to hear about more this morning, and many predictions are out there. Transforming work, eliminating whole occupations, industries gone. We know that that will happen in some way, shape, or form, but our question is, how do we prepare our children for a changing nature of work? How do we adjust our schools so that people have the skills to adapt over time, that they're not locked in a particular set of skills? But this is also a big question mark. Will automation impact 40% of the jobs in this region or just a tiny fraction? We've already been through huge transformations with globalization, and we also look out to 2030, and some analysis we've done is we're actually facing a worker shortage, not a job shortage. And you heard from Russ earlier that we're almost at full employment. So the extent to which this happens is something that's a little bit beyond us, although a lot of the technology, of course, is coming here. The policy question, the regional question is, how do we make sure we transition people? How do we make sure that our institutions, our workforce development systems, our schools are seeing these trends and are able to respond in time? Another driving force is the federal government. The federal government is both a constant and a wild card. It is there, it will be a part of what we've done, but do we know exactly the way it's going to shape us? For many years, the federal government, of course, has been a huge part of this region, and it continues to be. Though in transportation, it's something that's declined significantly over time. The federal government was a clear part of building BART, but today it's only 10% of our $300 billion regional transportation plan. And counties like Santa Clara and other counties throughout the region have stepped up to the plate to fund transportation on our own. We are certainly going to have to continue to do that, but from research and development spending, we know that the federal government is a huge portion. possibly 2/3 of the $1 billion that Stanford spends on R&D, and close to 50% at UC Berkeley and UCSF. A major, major player in that, and the extent to which we're able to come up with our own dollars to continue to make the investments that drive this region forward is a choice that we make. But let's shift to trends. Those are the forces that we have to respond to, but here are a couple of trends that we think, to a certain extent, our actions much more can shape the outcome. We have a growing economy, we continue to have job growth, but future prosperity is not guaranteed. And we look at the trend line of employment, we have boomed since 2010, but we lost jobs from 2000 to 2010. And Russ was up here in those early years in the dot-com crash and looking at hundreds of thousands of job losses across this region. The choices that we make and the ability for us to come together to think about maintaining a competitive economy is the trend line that we can shape. London, Shanghai, Toronto, Singapore, Tel Aviv, Berlin, these are places that are developing innovation economies. They do not have the network of firms and research institutions that we have here and risk capital, but they are developing those. So how do we make sure that we continue to work together to shape a competitive economy? Inequality is also another trend, and also another trend that we can shape ourselves. It's on the rise. Now, this is certainly not something just true to the Bay Area. The chart below comes from the famous book by Thomas Piketty about the rise of inequality across many countries throughout the world. But some recent data that came out just a week or so ago, a couple weeks ago, is somewhat staggering. That in the United States, the top 400 people have more wealth than the bottom 150 million. That does not seem to be a stable level of wealth inequality, and something that we collectively should think about. What is our response? How do we change the trend line? And ultimately, how do we ensure that people throughout our region are participants in the economy going forward? And in California, wages for those at the bottom and the middle have not kept up with wages at the top. These are trends that are not inevitable. We know, looking outward, that we will continue to produce a significant number of low-wage jobs. Somewhere between 35% and 40% of future jobs will be low-wage. It is our policy choices about the quality of those jobs and the extent to which the people in those jobs feel a strong part of the community and are able to lead and live dignified lives within our region. Then there's affordability, which has been so front and center to what we think about on a daily basis in our region. We stopped sprawl, in large part, in the 9-county Bay Area. That's something we should feel proud of. This region has able to pull together and significantly protect open space, protect farmland. But what we didn't do was make sure that we built enough housing within our existing communities. Those are choices across every single one of our communities and our neighborhoods. And some recent analysis that we've been working on at SPUR shows that since 2000, we've actually underbuilt about 700,000 housing units. Just think about that for a moment. We added about 380,000 housing units from 2000 to about now. But we probably should have built about 700,000 additional units if we wanted people's housing costs to remain at 30%, which is the standard of what's affordable. And we know that people are spending 50, 60% of their income on housing. And so that's one of the reasons why so many people have left our region, so many people are not coming to our region that would like to be a part of this dynamic economy, and of course that's why we see such a growth in homelessness. These are choices, and this is a trend line that we want to change. Are we going to add sufficient supply? Becomes the question going forward at various income levels. And of course, are we going to innovate in new forms of construction? It's not a panacea, but this image here from Factory OS is one of the models of changing how we're delivering housing. Putting housing into factories is a piece of things. And of course, some of you may have heard of the recent CASA Compact that came out of a joint effort across the entire Bay Area with MTC, folks in the South Bay, folks throughout the region, looking at how do we produce enough housing, how do we preserve the existing affordable housing, and how do we protect people in place. That idea of a grand bargain and the extent to which we implement that is an example of what trend we are on, what direction we are headed in. And then there's congestion. We all know that that's what we face daily, and some ways that's the product of generations of really having developed a region built around the automobile. That post-war boom period where we added so many people to our region, we tended to add them typically around the automobile. That was the dominant transportation form at the time. And so we have freeways, and the freeways continue to fill up. So we certainly need to invest in transportation solutions, but we also have to think about the land use side. And in the coming decades, the question becomes, are we going to locate more of our jobs and more of our homes around the existing transit? And this is a map that we've shown before on the right that shows the distribution of office space in our region. And you can see some of the red dots, I believe in your color red, is around the rail stations. And the blue or the office space, it's sort of 1 to 3 miles. That's a lot of the pattern that we have in our region. But the policy question becomes, will the local communities around the Caltrain stations allow 1, 2, 3, 5 million square feet of office space? The pace of change of a lot of these companies necessitates the ability to expand quickly. Will the downtown cores around Caltrain have the zoning that accommodates that? Those are choices. If not, the jobs go to places that are much more auto-dominated. That we can change. And finally, the question of local control becomes one that we think of as a trend. This is not an inevitability, and I think you may have a poll question about this. Will we resist regionalism and expand local control? Are we going to work together to solve some of our big challenges? Going back, I mentioned how in the 1920s we came together to preserve open space. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we came together and we created these institutions that have endured with us today. But today, we have over 500 governments of various kinds in our region. We are very fragmented. Over 100 cities, 28 transit agencies, more than 200 school districts, 200 special districts. Those are the kinds of institutions that we are working with, and we have to work together in some way, shape, or form to figure out how to solve some of these major challenges over the coming decades. So I'm going to bring up my colleague Alicia John-Baptiste, who's going to be speaking about some of the scenarios going forward. And the idea is we have hope for a positive future if we can change the trends that we're on and respond effectively to the driving forces. So Alicia is going to share with us the 4 possible futures that we've been working on. Alicia.
Thank you, Egon. Good morning, everybody. Again, Alicia John-Baptiste with SPUR. Very happy to be sharing our work with you today. So Egon described a number of the trends and forces that will influence where we land as a region in 2070 based on the choices that we make today. And at SPUR, we've been generating scenarios for what that future might look like. And as we've been thinking through this set of questions, we've really focused on 2 essential questions that will define where we go over the next 50 years. The first of those questions being, will our economic prosperity continue or will it decline? The second question being, will the Bay Area become more socially inclusive or will we allow exclusion to grow worse? And our basic premise here is that the private sector generates the wealth that we use for both individual and collective purposes. So both the wages that we as individual people earn, as well as the taxes that we generate as a region for our social systems. Now, the private sector also is a source of vitality and innovation and creative problem solving, and there's a lot of value in that. We've chosen to focus on this question of wealth because what we choose to do with our wealth as a region has such serious implications for our outcomes as we look to 2070. Will we decide to invest in the public systems that we need in order for the region to thrive? Things like high-quality public transportation. Will we invest in our education system, modify our employment practices so that people who grow up here have access to our incredible economic engine? Will we come together as a region to make the changes that we know are needed for a positive future? And most fundamentally, will we decide that our own individual well-being is impacted by our collective well-being? Will how others are doing in this region of prosperity and opportunity start to become as important to us as how we ourselves are doing? So in our modeling, we looked at kind of 2 factors, and at one end we have high economic growth, at the other low economic growth, and on the other axis here we have high social inclusion and the other's low social inclusion. And by looking at the future through this lens, we came up with 4 different potential scenarios. The first of these we've called the gated utopia. And this is a scenario that combines a high degree of economic prosperity with a low degree of social inclusion. So this is a future where there's a really great lifestyle available to people who can afford it. We continue to be a center of innovation, but it's really only for the haves. And what we imagine in this future is that we've continued to amass great wealth as a region. And within the core, the real core of the region, we've chosen to use some of that wealth to invest in our social systems, things like public transportation, adaptation to climate change, clean and safe open spaces. But because we were unwilling in this future to change course on housing, we have created an inner core to the region that is really only accessible to the wealthy. And once you move into the outer part of the region, there's a very different future that's in play. It's one where there's not an economic base to invest in the social systems, so people continue to face crushing congestion. There's poor quality of public schools. We might have a little more housing affordability if we allowed sprawl. But at the end of the day, the ability to adapt to climate change in the outer parts of the region is very limited because of the lack of economic prosperity. The second scenario, which we've termed Rust Belt West, is one that has much greater social inclusion but very low economic prosperity. So this is a future where our political and our regulatory response has essentially driven private industry away. So we have a deep commitment to the social welfare of all, but we actually have very little capital to realize our aspirations. We imagine in this future that perhaps people have gotten creative and they move around using solar-powered jitneys, and our public schools double up as urban farms. We pay high taxes in this future, but because there's so little base, we don't have the ability to respond to climate change. And when major natural disasters come, there's very little that we can do to rebuild. In this future, because of the lack of economic prosperity, we're also losing our population because young people are leaving to look for economic opportunity elsewhere. The third scenario we've called Bunker Bay Area, and this combines low economic growth with high degree of social exclusion. And in this future, we've gotten here by essentially stepping away from our tradition of collective problem solving in the Bay Area. We've decided that personal liberty has become more important than anything else. And as a result of that, we've allowed both money and power to rest in the hands of very few people. For those folks, they can still move around. Maybe at this point they're using highly secured transportation systems. You could imagine perhaps the helicopters of Sao Paulo. Fortified housing, exclusive schools. But because we have not cared for the commons, and because we have no access points to our economic engine, at the end of the day, many people are living in poverty, and our ability to grow economically is severely hampered. The final scenario that we've developed is one that combines both economic prosperity and high levels of social inclusion. And in this one, we've created a Bay Area that is a place of opportunity for everyone. We've essentially decided that we can both grow the pie as well as divide it more equally. So what that means practically is that in this future in 2070, we're paying high taxes and we are using that money in an efficient and effective way to deliver high-quality public transportation, clean, safe, open spaces, proactive responses to climate change, affordable housing. Very importantly, in this future, we have changed course on housing, and we have decided to allow housing to be built in sufficient quantities so that we can accommodate demand without turning to sprawl. We've also recognized the ways in which our historic patterns of inequity have led to the exclusion and disenfranchisement of many communities. And we've adapted our practices, whether they are educational, economic, political, planning practices, we've adapted them to redress those concerns. So we've essentially entered into a new agreement in this new social compact. And at its essence, this is an agreement that acknowledges that we cannot separate our individual well-being from the collective well-being, that the private sector plays a critical role in our region to generate our capacity to take care of our collective needs, and that the investment in the social system drives the vitality and diversity that is required for the private sector in turn to have real success. Now, we've been looking at 2070, and I do want to take a minute to just turn our attention to where we are today. Arguably, we are at the doorstep of the gated utopia in the Bay Area. Those of us who are privileged enough to have been able to buy homes here with Prop 13 tax rates, who are privileged enough to work in our innovation economy, can afford to live in really lovely communities. We can access our region's open spaces. We can send our children to private school. We can take Uber or Lyft when we need to avoid driving. Some of us are even able to use our public transportation systems on a regular basis, or walk or bike where we need to go. But that is not the reality for many people who are living in our region today. And many of us confront these realities the minute we step outside our door. Suffocating congestion, an affordability crisis that has people living on our streets in astronomical numbers, and if not on our streets, then in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change, perhaps leaving the region altogether. And while those of us who live in these lovely communities may not have this exact experience every day, it is very hard for us to avoid this reality. At the same time that we are arguably in crisis, we can see that the Bay Area continues to have the collective and political will to make the improvements that are needed to shift the direction of our future. Over the past 8 years, we've passed 12 different local measures to fund transportation. Just recently, Santa Clara County passed an almost $1 billion bond to support affordable housing. And in 2016, voters across the 9 counties, for the first time ever, came together to support a parcel tax to pay for wetlands restoration and flood control. So we can see that we have the will to make the changes that are needed. With that said, and Egon referenced this, we are not yet working at scale. When Regional Measure 3 came through last year, SPUR was a huge supporter, feeling like this was an important step to invest in our transportation system. And Regional Measure 3 was the bridge toll increase that generated $4.5 billion of transportation investments. But when we look at what is needed to retrofit our transportation system for both our population today and the way that we need to move, the amount of money in orders of magnitude is more on the realm of 100 to 150 billion. So 4.5 billion is a great first step, but is nowhere near enough. Similarly, passing affordable housing bond measures at the local scale is very, very important. But if we as a region cannot figure out how to build middle-income housing, we will not have middle-income people living in this region. They will simply be priced out. When we look at climate change, and this has hit home so closely recently here in the Bay Area, when we look at climate change, we know we need massive retrofits to our infrastructure and to our neighborhoods to keep us safe as these changes come through. And a $12 parcel tax, as admirable as it is not going to get us there. We have been acting locally, but to solve these problems, we do need to start thinking, planning, and acting as a region. If we look back 50 years, these 3 women, Kay Kerr, Sylvia McLaughlin, and Esther Golick, saved the Bay. And they did it with their connections, but it was their action as 3 people that turned what was a deteriorating asset into one of the things that the Bay Area is most iconically recognized for. 50 years later, our population has grown from 4.6 million to a little bit more than 8 million. And the complexity of our systems and our structures has grown in parallel to our population increase. We are no longer at a point in time where three people, even as competent, as connected as these three women were, can make the changes that we need. Coming together today to face these challenges is the first step we can take towards achieving the future that we are hoping to see in 50 years. Looking at this room today, what I see is a tremendous amount of power. Each of you here is successful. Each of you here has access to resources, whether they are financial or social or both. There's no single playbook that is going to take us to the future that we are hoping for. What it requires is for each of us to understand that our individual choices and our individual actions aggregate up to collective impact. And we all can make choices and take actions that move us to the future that we are dreaming of. We invite you to join us in moving toward the future that cares for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Egon. We have 9 minutes remaining for a robust conversation. I'm going to get right to it. And fabulous presentations, by the way. Thank you. All right, so first question. I would gather that you both think we're headed for the bunker scenario or the gated utopia scenario. Am I right about that? I mean, that's where you see us headed, more or less. And of course, the favorite scenario would be this new social compact. That's pretty obvious from your remarks. So here's the question: how do we get there? What does it take for the Bay Area to change its destiny and achieve the new social compact? What's our checklist? Start with you, Egon.
Well, I think that every decision we're faced with gives us an opportunity to see what direction we're on. And this week, just to give an example, with the governor's announcement about high-speed rail, led a number of people to say, oh, he killed the project. It's not going forward. In fact, that's not what he said. He said, let's take a fresh start. Let's think about this project differently. Let's treat it as more than a train project, as a chance to really economically transform the Central Valley. How do we then, just using that as an example, come together and say, no, that is a vision that we still want to fulfill? How do we in the Bay Area make the case to the rest of the state, to the Central Valley, that is important? It is essential for us to come up with the funds on our own, to take some of the funds that we might be putting into highway expansion all throughout the state, put some of that money into building Pacheco Pass, to link the train into San Jose and into the rest of the region. Those are the kind of choices that we can collectively make, and when we see a challenge in front of us, if we turn away from that and say, well, throw up our hands, there's not money from the federal government, that will show one of the directions we're on. And I think that's what we have to do. There's going to be these trigger points at each moment over the coming 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So I give that as an example of one where we don't shirk away from it, but we then come up with a different direction.
It takes organizing. It also probably takes something even more than that. It occurs to me that we need something like an overarching structure for planning, decision-making, and for governance. Alicia, do we need regional government?
I think that it's incredibly important in a democracy to both take care of the collective whole and protect the interests of the minority or the individual. I think what we have in the Bay Area right now is a lot of representation at the local level with the 101 cities and the many, many districts that Egon referenced. We don't have in a meaningful way, the counterbalance to that. What I would like to see is for us to strengthen our regional agencies so that we can have the conversation of what's needed at the local level as well as at the regional level to bring those things together. Right now, we're not hearing enough of the regional perspective.
So how do we accomplish that? Maybe I'm looking at you, Egon. We have 5, in fact, regional agencies, but they don't act coherently. Some baby steps in that direction. But let's just set all that aside. Let's say we are envisioning our perfect utopia out there. What is the ideal regional governance structure? What does it look like?
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen from the way we've approached regionalism is we tend to have a narrow scope in the institutions we have. They tend to try to do one thing, and they do it reasonably well. manage the bay, fund transportation. In recent years, I mentioned CASA. This was an attempt for our regional transportation agency, working with ABAG, working with a broad network of people, to take on the question of housing, come up with a grand bargain. That has resulted in some of the people on that institution being kicked off their seats by local government. If we can step back and say, no, wait, actually, this is a critical factor. A lot of people were involved in this. We have to make some hard choices. That institution must take on housing. We must think about a way to aggregate funds at the scale of the region and spend it where it's most appropriate. So an example is, how do we broaden the scope of the existing institutions? MTC and ABAG, the staff are merged. In the future, we should have the boards merged, a single board. Now, we can talk whether or not we should have that directly elected, and that's an interesting other question, but by putting those two functions together under one board, you then have the ability to think across scale, think across transportation, housing, other land use questions. I mentioned where jobs go. That has been a missing factor in a lot of our regional planning, and of course, planning for climate change and adapting to climate change. All those institutions are in the same building. Soon, BCDC will be in the joint building. So we have the ability to try to think across those scales, but we haven't yet done it.
I'm looking at the poll results. Several hundred people have voted, 68% in favor of regional government, 85 elected regional government, 85% in favor of consolidating all of the transit agencies into a single Bay Area transit agency. 76% really do view local control as an impediment to progress. Okay, one quick question. Do you think this is a representative sample?
Are you a representative sample? You tell us.
Well,
no. Maybe not. I think we've seen in the response to the CASA Compact that there may be a difference between some of the folks who are working at a grass tops level and the sentiment that exists in our communities. I think one of the things that's binding us together as a region today, whether we like it or not, is a pretty consistent fear of loss. Whether you're in a community that's facing displacement or it's a more affluent community that is resisting any added density, underneath that is a fear of loss. And I think it would serve us to ask the question, what is it that we're trying to protect? If we could figure out how to protect the core thing that people are afraid of losing, then the options in terms of governance and the way we manage ourselves, I think, become much more robust.
Thank you. Quickly, Egon, one piece of the puzzle, a big piece, I want to say, is our corporations that are located here, the tech firms and all the rest. What is their role in helping us achieve the scenario that we prefer?
I think they have a huge role, and we've actually seen recently the private sector become much more involved and engaged on some of these critical issues. The $500 million fund for affordable housing that was announced recently, significant leadership on thinking through what might be a kind of a major investment in transportation to connect our region, in fact, broadly Northern California. So I think that the corporations in this region have always been a key part of this long-term thinking, and I think in recent years we're starting to see leadership emerge that's both involved and engaged with joint venture, engaged with SPUR, engaged with other organizations, and then putting some dollars behind some of these key initiatives. And I think it's only going to move forward. One other piece of it, though, I think I mentioned is as we think of it, so maybe put this out a little bit as a challenge. I'd mentioned congestion and I mentioned job location. Think about where we locate our employment, our campuses, where we locate our homes. That's a critical piece because that's how we're all tied in this together. And if we're able to work, take the leadership and say, you know what, we actually really should be locating in a downtown setting, such as what's happening close by at Diridon Station as a proposal. Those are the kinds of moves that over the coming decades, if you've got 10, 15, 20 million square feet around a rail station, when we get the leadership and invest in that rail connection that links the places, then it works and it pays dividends over time. And as we densify, it actually gets better. Congestion is the kind of thing that actually gets worse as we densify. Congestion on the highways, if we're sort of on highways. But if we locate things around rail, the opposite happens. It gets better, and we have more dynamic places. That's a change direction we'd love to see.
We're out of time. It's interesting that we're going to hear from the Los Angeles mayor in the coming session. You mentioned how Regional Measure 3 generates $4 billion, basically, for us to spend. Greater Los Angeles, has just mobilized around $120 billion that they're putting specifically against transportation. We're going to hear about that. Is that the approach we need in the Bay Area? Their approach?
Yes.
Yep. Simple as that. Well, all right, so we'll hear from one of their representatives. We're out of time. Joint venture, Silicon Valley, SPUR, we see each other as sister organizations. I want to say on behalf of Joint Venture that we join you in this vision. We join you in wanting to work together towards this vision. We want to see our two organizations linked, working as true partners. I lay that on the table as a challenge and as an opportunity. We look forward to it. Thank you for being a part of our conference today. Ladies and gentlemen, Alicia, John-Baptiste.
Thank you all.
Egon, Terplan from SPUR.